I am Brian Conley. I'm a senior sales executive here with Bennett Adelson. I've been here for about 9 years. Thank you for joining Bennett Adelson's monthly webinar series. Today, we're going to have John Corlett, principal in our advanced infrastructure practice, who's going to speak about the strategies to break down resistance to technology adoption. We will be recording this event. It will be available on our website shortly after the event. If you have questions or comments, we encourage you to use the chat functionality. We will try and address those at the end of the session. But with no further ado, I'd go ahead and throw it over to John. Go ahead, John.
Hi, guys. Thanks, Brian. As Brian said, I'm John Corlett, a principal in advanced infrastructure practice, also dabble in security and compliance. And today we're going to talk about some of the strategies that we've used here at Bennett Adelson to help customers get through some challenges and resistance to new technology and some of our larger deployment projects. This is primarily going to be focused around large enterprise-wide type projects that you would do, say deploying teams for rapid remote work, as we've seen a lot of our customers do in response to like the COVID-19 crisis, or rolling out a new feature in Office 365 enterprise-wide. These are some of the things that we've done to help smooth the adoption and get users to use that new technology quicker and faster. So the first one, and this is probably kind of obvious to some, but we found that in a lot of cases that the IT department really doesn't focus on this a lot, is utilizing effective change management for these large deployments. People will ask how important is change management to a given project, and our position is that for a lot of projects, 100% of the outcome really depends on people doing their jobs differently than they were before. And that's very difficult to kind of break people's habits that they've been doing for several years. And often we find that if people don't change how they do their jobs, then it doesn't matter what changes us as IT are implementing. It's hard for them to figure out how to use the new tools. And really the end goal of any project is rarely to just install and deploy new software. The business case is really what's important, and that's usually expressed in terms of efficiency or effectiveness or even cost savings. And if people resist that change, the business case is in jeopardy, and a lot of times the project won't succeed. So it's really, really important that the people in IT and security really assess the impact of the project and its potential success of how effectively they'll get people to change how they do their work. What we see is, a lot of times in these larger deployments that IT departments and anybody still related to the deployment of technology is still kind of focused in the old school or this common approach where it's the majority of the efforts put around project management, and change management is really a small subset of that happens towards the end of the engagement. This could be we're putting in a change request into the change advisory board or CAB and getting a bunch of people to agree to it, and we roll that out, and that's really all we think about. Whereas in this cloud first world, the ideal support is to really have a separate adoption stream that's running in parallel and integrated with that work stream so that people are consistently focused on change management and the ability to change those people's work habits. And when when companies decide that they really do want to embrace change management, we found that the use of change management assessment tools to really engage the leadership is really the key to success here. If you don't secure buy-in from your executive sponsors around how the change management is going to be managed, you're not going to be very successful in getting people to adopt the new tools. Some of the kind of assessments that we like to focus on are really grounded in the ProSci model, and that's one of the most well-known change management models around. It's the one that Microsoft embraces, and depending on the size and scope of our project, we'll do things such as a change characteristic assessment and an impact assessment, and we'll even look at the organizational and management layers competency around the change management process and how willing and able they are to adapt to this new world of thinking, as well as going into training needs, team members, and many different layers. You really need to assess the project health by looking at least these three components. I can't stress enough, again, how important it is to secure leadership or sponsorship at an executive level to make sure they're on board and walking in step with the technology teams as you roll out this new feature, because they're really the key to getting management and users to use the new tools. And this ProSci change management model focuses on these three critical elements in any change management program, whether that's for a smaller type project like giving a new department SharePoint sites, or if this is a really large deployment where we're going to light up teams for the whole enterprise. All of these three critical areas are kind of dependent on each other, and they're really needed to really drive change management home through the organization. And by doing some of these pre-assessments or preliminary change assessments that I mentioned earlier, you can really clearly define people's roles and help give them specific and tactical areas where they can help in the overall project. It's very important also to understand the risk by looking at really two key aspects of the change and how it's going to affect the organization. You need to look at the size and scope, right? Is this just for a specific department or geography, or is it enterprise-wide? And then it's very important as well to look at the organization in a whole and kind of gauge their readiness or resistance to change in the first place. Really, any effective approach must be scalable, but too often decisions about the appropriate magnitude of the change management strategy is made on either the back of a napkin, or it's not formally defined up front, so that again you can really garner that executive sponsorship and get management on board with the activities that IT is doing. I do want to just kind of go over some of the change management best practices that we like to focus. These are based off of some proven Microsoft user adoption models. Specifically, they've been developed a lot for helping roll out teams throughout the organization. Really, the management assessments and project sponsors are great to help them understand the importance of their support for this project. And we're going to go into just a little bit of details around those best practices. So really defining the change in scope and what you're trying to get out of this effort is super important, right? Everybody's heard about, using SMART goals to define things, and that is very important. But you've got to ask all these other questions and really figure out what kind of key performance indicators you're going to create to measure how these changes are happening. Now, Microsoft's made huge strides in some of the kind of out of the box reporting metrics that are available for Office and Office 365 in general, but those can be greatly enhanced with your own custom KPIs, leveraging things such as Power BI or the Graph API to generate your own reports and really hone in on how your users are adopting to this new rollout. And all of those are very extensible and very possible, but if you can't define the change scope and the objectives of what is important to you to measure, it's going to be really hard to customize or enhance those reports outside of what's available out of the box. And one of the areas that we see missed in a lot of the projects that we become involved in, where organizations don't have a formal change management team, is really focusing in and identifying specific and prioritized scenarios, right? So it's very, very helpful to go through an exercise where you're defining business use cases and kind of modeling, like you see below, how difficult that change in behavior is going to be to affect and what the impact is to those areas. And if you focus in the green squares early on in your piloting, or as you're rolling out or deciding to roll out who you would hit first, if you're able to identify and prioritize these, you can focus on the right audience that's going to benefit the most from the change you're deploying, and you will have quicker, easier wins in the beginning, and you'll also get better feedback from the user community. We also find that it's pretty important to develop detailed success plans, right? Things like if you've done some assessments and you've garnered your management buy-in and your stakeholders, how well are they being engaged? How well are your communications and trainings plans being adopted? It's very important to kind of at least think of these areas and develop a basic plan, but even we're encouraging you to vet those out a little bit further and get detailed. And I don't want you guys to feel that I'm saying that this is all the responsibility of the IT department that's actually deploying this change, but these things are critical to the overall success of the project and should be discussed with either the project management office or the executive sponsors to make sure that you're capturing all of these recommendations and best practices, and you're setting yourself up for success. So from the stakeholder engagement perspective, right, you see at the very top of the pyramid again is the executive sponsor. And that is the most important factor that you can have to help drive this change throughout your organization. Really getting them engaged is super important. And this deck will be available after the presentation if you want to spend a little bit more time in either the description, because I know it's kind of small. I had a lot to fit on this side, or some of these recommendations. So feel free to download that and share it with your project team. But at a minimum, right, you have to define kind of the foundational change network that you're going to engage, which includes the managers and supervisor layers, and then your project sponsor and your executive sponsor. And then as you get more used to working through organizational change management, you can add peer level and mid-level leaders into your process to help improve on the next project, right? And then communications is an area where we see large gaps commonly. And we like to develop a formal communication plan similar to what you see here, where we identify the audience and the subject or content that we're going to set out and put together the schedule of the frequency of these communications. And sometimes it's even easier at the bottom to get buy-in here is if you start with a more simple table like you see in the key tactics and senders by audience and project phase to get approval from either the CAB or the OCM team, the sponsors, and the managers before you put a lot of effort into the actual summary. But by having this kind of laid out in this manner and formalized, it helps you talk through the process better. And it also gives you an opportunity to test this plan when you're piloting or you're in your experimental phase and adjust before you send your first communications out to, say, the production deployment or the actual end users once you hit full stride. And obviously, training is very important to this process. The biggest gap that we normally see in these large enterprise-wide engagements really evolves around user training, and its dependency on getting users to adopt that change. If you take an example of, say, Office 365 groups, or now they're called Microsoft 365 groups. Groups is the container that gets created in several different Office properties that help manage permissions. If users aren't trained on how to properly manage and use groups, then it's very easy for them to make mistakes on who they're granting membership to and introduce undesirable outcomes that the security or the IT team might decide to then lock down. And you end up getting a result where they prevent users from making new groups, and that slows down all of the kind of collaborative purpose that the Office cloud gives you in the first place, because IT and security are scared to open things up. So again, it's very important to consider your training and your training plan and to kind of segment that by audience. And then measurement, right? I talked about developing those KPIs. It's important to figure out what you want to measure. And the only way that you can really gauge your success is by measuring the outcomes. And then enforcement is very important to these larger, reinforcement is very important to these larger initiatives. And what this really means is creating good feedback and analysis loops. So as you roll this technology out to your user communities, you're gaining some feedback as to how successful that rollout is, and you're looking at the adoption metrics, and it gives you the data and information for you to finally review and maybe make some modifications and act on changes prior to deploying to the next round of users. So that, by the time you hit velocity, you've got a pretty well-formed and well-oiled machine. Now, in a lot of these recommendations, I'm not saying that you should spend, tons and tons of time and effort to vet all of this out completely. By introducing something like this reinforcement app, it allows you to set up some minimal components and then improve on the process as you go. Another huge aspect, and this is not to be confused with training, is really educating sponsors, and if you've been able to do an assessment and identify detractors, it's very important to educate them on the new technology to help garner support for your project. One of the projects I just recently completed involved a state government, and it was approximately 60,000 users spread over 20 different state agencies. And all of these different agencies worked out of a single Office 365 tenant, but they each had their own agency security officers, and each agency kind of had a seat in decisions that we were making as far as security controls and what settings we were going to allow in the Office 365 tenant. And as we kind of moved through the original engagement, which included migrating their users from shared drives on a file server into OneDrive and into departmental drives on a file server into SharePoint, it quickly became obvious that a lot of the agency security officers didn't have enough information about how security and secure file and storage access worked in Office 365. So they were very anti, let's move to Office 365. And their common response was, we don't trust data that's being stored out there, or it's not secure. One of the ways we helped counter this was giving a bunch of these partner-led, the partner being Bennett Adelson, immersion experiences through Microsoft. Now, if you guys aren't familiar with the CIEs, this is where a certified immersion experience facilitator provisions a demonstration tenant of Office 365 with all of the bells and whistles turned on, and walks through some real-world business scenarios while members of the audience have their own computer to walk through that experience with you. And you can see the results of the settings that we decided to create, from security controls and features that we were going to enable. We could see that in kind of a pseudo demo environment before making any changes to production, which in itself was very powerful to help break down some of the detractors. But it also allowed them to ask questions specifically to myself, a knowledgeable architect on 365. And those questions were generally spawned from the interactions that we were doing in the immersion session. So they didn't have enough information to know what questions to ask in the beginning until they actually got in this sandbox and started sending emails and seeing DLP block it, and and labeling content and seeing how MCAS could do session controls, etc., which made them think of other questions. And it really, really was a powerful tool that we were able to reduce the FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that they had, and really have them turn a 180 and get on board with the project after seeing all of this in action. So really, really powerful tool. You know, you can reach out to Bennett Adelson if you're interested in any of these immersion experiences. This is just a few samples of what's out there. With the hearts are some of the more popular ones that we go through. So we've leveraged ones for security professionals when people are looking at deploying Microsoft Cloud App Security or Microsoft Defender ATP, or teamwork for groups that are deploying Teams, or the modern workplace to see SharePoint, Teams, you know, OneDrive, the whole shebang. And this is a really powerful way to get sponsors and managers on board. Another big factor, and I kind of touched on this on the change management side, but from the educational side, was to target specific business use cases to highlight improvements in this educational kind of outreach. So again, you want to find your quick wins and your first successes and be able to create some scenarios that will be the most impactful or the most helpful to your users, and show them in kind of a real world scenario how this will make their workflow easier, right? And if you can relay it back to the business or back to the user and kind of show it what's in it for me, instead of the old school way of, you know, I'm IT and this is just what we're doing, so you're going to have to use it, it can be very powerful. And the Microsoft recommended kind of template to help you get going for identifying these use cases is the picture below, right? As someone in fill in the blank in here, management, I want to blank using blank. And notice how in here the key is, I'll know this is successful when, if you can define this, this goes a long way to you helping you define your KPIs and what you're going to measure to help ensure that the users are adopting the technology as you'd hoped. It's also very important to define a minimal governance plan before implementation to avoid impacting users, right? So if you just open the throttle and turn Teams on and have people starting to use it, and then security or management comes by and says, oh, well, we didn't want to allow external user sharing, or we didn't want to allow non-corporate people to be able to share files in meetings, for instance, and then you have to go implement those controls and reduce the functionality that you just rolled out to your early adopters. That's really a bad situation to get in. It's much better practice to come up with a basic set of governance that you want to put in place first. So you have some ground rules. And in this example, we're looking at Teams governance, but this would be for any of the technologies you want to reduce. These are kind of the basic questions that you need to ask and define. So you set those up before even your pilot. And then as you roll out and as you have developed these feedback loops and you're getting feedback from your pilot users or your experimental users, the early adopters, or even your alpha phase, and go into a more broader deployment, you can slowly hone and add to these capabilities afterwards, right? Like here's just an example for those previously mentioned Office 365 or M365 groups. This is an example and the licensing required to impact just some of the management capabilities that are available, right? So you can imagine if you don't kind of think about this and have some sort of base governance exercise prior to deploying the technology, and you decide that now you want to enforce, say, the first thing, a group naming policy, not only do you have to then tell people that they could name it whatever they want, that you have a new policy, but you can see that this particular feature requires an Azure Active Directory P1 license assigned to people that are allowed to create the policies. And, you know, Office 365, remember that there are some things that you can do by individual property, say a site collection or individual teams, but others are tenant-wide settings. And if you're in a position like the state government that I had mentioned, where you have 20 different state agencies, basically separate business units, all with their own management and kind of IT voice sharing a policy, you can imagine how important it is to work with those groups to lay out at least a minimum set of governance rules so that you don't have to change something after the fact, right? And the governance should include at least the basics like user assignments and the access to secure data that you want to go through. So this doesn't necessarily have to do with things like Azure Information Protection or sensitivity labels per se. This protection level is kind of you and the organization sitting together, talking to the sponsors and the change management and the business and all of the stakeholders, and kind of defining a couple categories that where you want to wrap controls or access around, and coming up with some common sense terminology to make it much easier when it comes time to training the users to figure out, you know, where we're going to allow certain things to happen. And if you can make it as simple as this, you know, a couple basic categories and some descriptive terms that kind of make sense, it's much easier to train the users on good data custodianship and usage than it is if you come up with some more obscure or department descriptive type names that don't make intuitive sense. So just be aware of that. And after you've created this baseline policy, it's very easy to then extend that as you learn more through your feedback loops to get much more comprehensive. And of course, this will be dependent on your individual technology that you're deploying or your workload or your company culture. And I'm not saying that this level of detail is desired or that it's required at the front. But if you focus on creating that simple baseline first and not worry about this level of detail in the beginning and roll this out already pre-configured at your pilot group, you'll have much better information and maybe even be able to get to this point quicker than if you had skipped this step. And finally, a huge area that we don't see people taking advantage of is really leveraging the native Azure tools to help with either automation or helping reduce the time it takes to deploy assets by looking at some of the features available. So we haven't seen a lot of the small to mid-sized businesses really yet embrace things like Power Apps or Power Automate or Logic apps or forms until there's some education around not only those features, but to be able to talk to, say, your partner like Bennett Adelson around some good real world examples of how these things can be leveraged in your organization for workflow or orchestration or surveys can really speed up the internal IT team's ability to leverage these kind of tools and make it easier on the overall deployment plan. One of the ways we've leveraged these tools for automation is with a tool that we developed called Provision. Now, Provision was developed to allow any size organization to leverage Microsoft Teams and SharePoint in a very safe, secure, and controlled manner. We really wrote it based on that previous case study that I discussed with the government customer that we had that didn't want to allow their users to create Microsoft 365 groups and the corresponding SharePoint and Team sites and OneDrives on their own, but they didn't want their small help desk to have to kind of field all of the requests for new sites or new teams as they came in while they were trying to adopt it. So we wrote Provision to help them with that. Now, the way it kind of works is we lock down the ability for end users to create new groups, which is really the trigger in Office 365 to create a SharePoint site or a Team site or Yammer or OneDrive. And we created a Power App in Azure that kind of fields and captures the request information for a new site. So we drive users to a site that has a link to the Power App. The Power App kicks off and asks them a bunch of questions that we had previously worked out in a governance workshop. And with those questions answered, that would kind of direct them to one of the security baselines that we previously discussed and create a site request in a SharePoint list. And that site request was monitored by Azure Automation, where a flow got triggered and starts an approval process that we worked out to call the appropriate automation PowerShell scripts to provision new sites. And then a runbook went and took the request answers and categorized the site and either provision a new team site, a new communication site, or a new Microsoft team, all automatically and reduced to the time that it took to meet and satisfy their workflow requirements, which was all done through Outlook with a simple button that their manager had to just press to approve or disapprove the request process. So very, very cool tool. Kind of to wrap up, change management, super important. I'd really encourage you to reach out to some of our change management experts if you're not already mature in an organizational change management process to ask any questions. I'm really a good resource here at Bennett Adelson to discuss kind of the governance settings, and have worked with several different companies to kind of help them start at that minimum baseline. One of the advantages of bringing a partner in is it can kind of help speed the coordination and get the answers to those questions quicker than what a lot of the internal IT folks are able to garner for the organization. And then that educational piece to kind of address directly the detractors is super important. And then, being able to leverage some of the automation tools is really quite powerful as well. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions.